The Varath citadel at Keth Morin is carved directly from the plateau, not built upon it. That was the first thing I noticed when I crested the last switchback, and the full face of the place opened up in front of me. No mortar lines, no seams where block met block, just a continuous face of pale sandstone that had been cut inward rather than stacked upward. The Varath did not raise their fortresses. They ate into the earth and left the skin of the stone as their wall, and the result was something that looked less like a military installation than like a cliff that had decided, over centuries, to grow corridors. The sun was nearly directly overhead. Noon at this altitude comes with a particular quality of light, hard, white, indifferent, that strips everything of shadow and makes the details of a thing difficult to hold onto. The sandstone face of Keth Morin was the color of old teeth in that light. The approach road, a broad cut in the plateau stone wide enough for 3 of their heavy transports abreast, ran straight to the main gate without curve or deviation. The Varath had built it that way on purpose. There was no approach that offered cover. Anyone walking toward the gate walked in the open, under the full sun, visible from the rampart slits for the entire final quarter kilometer. I walked it alone. I had practiced the walk. Not the physical walk. The plateau approach was not technically demanding, but the experience of it. I had stood at the forward position the previous evening in the last light, and I had worked through the scenario in the way I had learned to work through scenarios before difficult insertions, not rehearsing what I would say or what I would do, but simply putting myself inside the experience of the walk and the gate and the hall and the 300 blades, and checking whether my body was going to cooperate. It was the kind of practice that looks, from the outside, like a person standing still and staring at nothing. What it is on the inside is a conversation between the thinking mind and the body, in which the thinking mind says, "Here is what we are about to face," and the body says, "I understand," and the thinking mind says, "Can you manage it?" and the body either says yes or it doesn't. Mine said yes. I had trusted it before in harder circumstances than this, and it had not been wrong. The arrangement had taken 11 months to make. I want to be precise about that number because it matters in ways I did not fully understand until the day I finally walked that road. 11 months of back-channel messages sent through third-party couriers, species who traded in both human and Varath spheres, and wanted the shooting to stop as badly as anyone. 11 months of rejected overtures and unanswered transmission codes, of 2 forward operating bases overrun, and 3 contact teams simply not reporting in. 11 months of the war continuing to eat through everything it touched on the border worlds, while people on both sides of a conference table that did not yet exist argued about the shape of that table. At some point in the 5th month, I stopped tracking the individual incidents, because the tracking had begun to feel like a form of punishment I was inflicting on myself, and I shifted to tracking only the back-channel responses, of which there were, in those 11 months, exactly 4 that contained anything worth reading, and 1 that contained what I was looking for. I was not a diplomat. I need to say that clearly because the word gets applied to anyone who walks into an enemy position under a flag of parley, and the application is usually wrong. I was a scout. My full designation was Forward Scout, 1st Class, Reconnaissance Division, 7th Expeditionary Group, which is the military's way of saying I spent most of my career in places I was not supposed to be, watching things I was not supposed to see, and getting myself back out again without being caught. What made me useful in those positions was not bravery. I was regularly and sincerely afraid, but a particular quality of patience that my first squad leader had described, without flattery, as the closest thing to stillness a human body can achieve. He meant it as a compliment. He also meant it as an observation about something that was not entirely comfortable to be. A person whose instinct, when confronted with a threat, was not to act but to wait, and to keep waiting, and to continue waiting past the point where most people would have made a decision. That quality had served me well in reconnaissance. It had served me less well in certain other parts of my life. It had served me adequately in the 11 months of back-channel communication and rejection and silence that preceded this walk, during which I had done a great deal of waiting and very little that felt like progress. The Varath requested me specifically. That was the other thing I needed to understand, and it had taken me months to understand it correctly. When the back-channel couriers returned with the first real response from Keth Morin, not a rejection, not a silence, but an actual response with conditions in it. The message contained 3 conditions for a parley. It had to be conducted in the citadel itself. It had to be a single human representative, and that representative had to be me, identified by my designation, my division, my group, not by my name, which they either did not know or did not consider relevant. The Varath had a file on me. Whatever was in that file was the reason I was walking up this road instead of someone with actual diplomatic credentials and proper training in the field. I had spent some time thinking about what might be in that file. I had spent time I probably should have been using for mission preparation, sitting in my bunk and working through the question methodically. The reconnaissance actions they were most likely to have documented were 6 insertion operations across the border zone in the previous 2 years, 3 of which had gone cleanly, and 2 of which had gone cleanly enough, and 1 of which had gone badly in ways that I preferred not to think about in detail, but that had resulted in my being the only member of a 4-person unit to return. The Varath had been present at all 6 in some capacity. Whether they had observed me specifically in any of them, or whether what they had was an indirect file assembled from unit after-action reports and border incident records, I could not determine. What I could determine was that a species whose warriors trained from adolescence, and whose honor law was built around specific acts of judgment and recognition, had decided, on the basis of whatever file they had assembled, that I was the correct human to bring to this room. I had my own reason for accepting the assignment. It was sitting in my breast pocket, against my sternum, wrapped in a fold of waxed cloth to keep it dry. I had been carrying it for 11 months. I had been carrying it since the day Kale Drossian pressed it into my palm in the back of a medevac transport somewhere over the Thresh corridor, 3 hours before he died of his wounds. Kale Drossian had been a Varath. Not a soldier, or not anymore. He had been something the Varath called a cord breaker, which is their term for a member of the warlord caste who has voluntarily severed allegiance to their hereditary line. It is, in Varath honor law, the most serious act a caste member can perform. More serious than defection, because defection implies the allegiance still exists somewhere and has simply been transferred to a different recipient. Cord breaking is the public declaration that the cord itself, the binding, no longer holds, that the one who breaks it has judged their warlord line unworthy of continuation, and accepted all consequences of that judgment. The consequences were severe and not theoretical. A cord breaker had no rights of protection under any Varath house. Any member of any Varath line could kill them without legal sanction, without record, without consequence under oath law. They were outside the structure entirely, not enemies, which would have granted them a certain formal status, but simply removed as if the structure had never contained them. Kale had been fighting alongside human units for 7 months when the transport went down. He had come to us not because he loved humanity. He was pragmatic about us, occasionally critical in ways that were fair and once or twice in ways that were uncomfortable. And he had told me directly in one of our early conversations that he found human emotional expressiveness exhausting, which was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in a professional context in years. But because he could not remain inside a structure he considered corrupt. And we were the only alternative to dying alone in the borderlands. He carried no weapons by the time I met him. He had given them up at some point before he found his way to our unit, which was its own kind of statement among the Varath, though I did not understand the full weight of that statement until much later. I had asked him about it once. in the particular way you ask things when you know the answer is probably more than you are equipped to process. Carefully, leaving the question open so he could decline it. He had been quiet for a long time, and then said that he had decided there were things he was not willing to use anymore, which was not an explanation, but was also, I came to understand, the most he was going to say. What he gave me in the back of that transport was a length of dark braided leather cord. It was perhaps 30 centimeters long, tied at both ends into a specific knot I had never seen before and could not replicate if asked, and worn smooth in the middle where it had been held in a fist for a very long time. The leather darkened and compressed and polished in the way that only comes from years of contact, not from any deliberate treatment. It was clearly old. How old I could not say. The Varath age their materials differently than we do, and I had no useful frame of reference. It was a piece of Varath material culture I had no context for, handed to me by a dying man, and the instruction that came with it was exactly 1 sentence long. He said in his accented but precise standard, "When you meet the Warden, show him this. He will know what it means." Then he closed his eyes, and 3 hours later he was gone. I had spent 11 months trying to get to the Warden. In that time I had shown the cord to exactly 2 other people, my commanding officer, who had it photographed and sent to 3 separate xenocultural analysis teams, none of whom could identify the specific knot form with confidence, and a Varath specialist linguist attached to the expeditionary group's intelligence division, who went pale when she saw the photograph and said, very quietly, that if that cord was what she thought it was, I needed to be very careful who else saw it. She would not tell me more than that. She said she needed to verify, and then the border offensive that month pulled her division 3 systems away, and I never got the full answer I was looking for. I had filed the exchange in the part of my mind reserved for incomplete information, which in reconnaissance work is quite a large part of the available space, and I had kept the cord in my breast pocket and kept trying to get to Keth Morin, and 11 months later here I was. I want to describe the blades accurately, because inaccuracy about the Varath in a military context is the kind of mistake that gets people killed in ways that cannot later be corrected. They do not carry what a human would call a sword, though the word gets used by people who have not seen them drawn in operational conditions. A Varath combat blade is longer than a human broadsword, curved along its full length in a specific geometry that shifts the balance point toward the tip rather than the guard, and they wear them across the back in a paired carry, one over each shoulder, which means a Varath drawing both weapons simultaneously brings them out and down in a motion that is faster than most human combatants expect. Their warlord caste soldiers train from early adolescence. The blades they carry are personal, made specifically for the individual, weighted for their specific build and their specific reach and the specific way they have been trained to move, and they maintain them the way a human artisan might maintain a primary tool, with attention, with regularity, with something that, if you spent enough time around Varath and paid enough attention to the way they handled those blades outside of operational contexts, you recognized as love, not sentimentality. Love in the older sense, a careful tending, an acknowledgement that the thing is worth the attention. 300 of them were standing in the entrance hall of Keth Morin when the gate opened and I walked in. The hall was a long internal chamber cut from the same continuous sandstone as the outer face, lit from above by a series of narrow shafts that brought the noon light down in bright columns angled slightly south. The effect was dramatic, and I think deliberately so. The light columns were positioned such that anyone walking in from the gate walked through alternating bands of bright light and shadow, which made it difficult to read the faces of the figures standing on either side while keeping yourself fully illuminated. I counted the blades because counting was what I did in places where I needed to manage my own fear and keep it from migrating into my face or my hands. Both blades per soldier, visible across the back of every figure in the hall, which meant 600 blades in the room. The soldiers themselves stood in 2 columns, one on each side of the central path, at least 3 rows deep, and they did not move when I entered. They did not shift their weight or turn their heads or make the small adjustments that a human formation makes when a new element enters the space. They stood the way Varath stand when they are being formal, which is to say with the absolute economy of people who have trained their bodies over years and years to waste nothing, not weight, not motion, not attention. At the far end of the hall was a raised stone platform, and on the platform was a single chair, not a throne, nothing so ornate, just a broad seat of dark wood set into a stone base that had been cut from the same continuous sandstone as everything else, and in the chair sat the warden. I had studied what images we had of him, which were not many and not recent. Varath warlord caste males of his generation tended to read as large to human eyes even by Varath standards, and the warden was large even by that measure, broad across the chest and shoulders in a way that the seated position did not diminish, with the characteristic Varath facial structure. The pronounced orbital ridges, the jaw that carried more horizontal width than a human face is structured to carry. The 4-lobed auditory organs folded flat against the skull in a configuration that, among Varath, indicated controlled attention rather than relaxation. His skin was the pale gray-green of high-altitude Varath, the coloration that comes from generations of living at elevation, where the light spectrum runs harder and the air is thinner, and the body adapts over time in the ways bodies adapt when they have no alternative. He was wearing what appeared to be a formal version of combat dress, not decorative, not ceremonial in the soft sense of that word, but the same functional garment as his soldiers, distinguished only by a single marking at the left shoulder that I had been told in the briefings indicated the warden rank. He had no expression I could read as I walked toward him. The Varath face at rest is difficult for humans to interpret with any confidence. The muscles that carry emotional data in our species are distributed differently in theirs, and the signals that matter are often in the orbital ridges and the auditory organ positioning rather than the mouth or the eyes. The linguist had given me a basic primer on reading Varath faces in the preparation sessions, and I had studied it with the same attention I gave to terrain maps before an insertion. What I could say with confidence, looking at the warden as I walked the length of the hall, was that he was watching me fully, without any pretense of disinterest, and that the orbital ridges were in the neutral controlled position and the auditory organs were flat. He was attending. Whatever was happening internally, he was present. I stopped at the base of the platform steps. I had rehearsed what I was going to say. I had a formal opening that the linguist had written out for me in phonetic Varath, a greeting that acknowledged the warden's rank and the legitimacy of his court, that used the correct honorifics and the correct grammatical structure for an address from a non-Varath requesting audience. And I had practiced it until I could deliver it without stumbling, even under conditions designed to unsettle me. The linguist had spent 2 sessions actively trying to unsettle me as I practiced, which was generous of her and professionally sound, and by the end of the 2nd session, I had gotten the delivery steady. I had also prepared a statement of the Human Expeditionary Command's position and the broad terms we were authorized to discuss. I had, at the linguist's suggestion, a documented record of every engagement in the preceding 11 months in which human units had taken actions that might be characterized as disproportionate or in violation of the implicit rules of engagement in the border zone, because showing the Varath that you had recorded your own failures and were willing to name them was, she said, the only kind of opening that the warden caste interpreted as honest rather than strategic. I said none of it. I do not know exactly why. Some of it was the hall itself, the weight of 300 blades in the silence, the light coming down in those angled columns that kept putting me in the bright and taking the room around me into the relatively dim, the warden sitting in his chair at the far end watching me with that quality of unreadable Varath attention. Some of it was that I had been carrying the cord for 11 months, and I had spent 11 months not knowing what it meant, and I was standing in the one place in the known universe where someone could tell me, and the prepared words felt, in that moment, very small next to that specific fact. And some of it, I think, was something simpler and harder to articulate, that I had gone into that hall to do what Kale had asked me to do, and the prepared opening and the position statement and the documented failures were all real and all necessary, but they were not that. They were not the thing that had actually got me to Keth Morin. What had got me to Keth Morin was the cord, and so the cord was what I reached for. I reached into my breast pocket. I unfolded the waxed cloth slowly. I moved slowly throughout, with the deliberate economy that reconnaissance teaches you when you are in rooms full of armed people who are watching your hands and making assessments based on what your hands do, and I took out the cord and I held it up. I held it up in my right hand, cord hanging from my fist, knots visible at both ends, the braided leather dark against the bright column of noon light coming down from the shaft directly above me. I did not say anything. I just held it up and waited. The silence in the hall changed. I had been in rooms where a silence changed, and I had been in rooms where it did not, and I had learned the difference with my skin before I learned to articulate it. The difference between a silence that is just an absence of sound and a silence that is a thing in itself, a presence with weight and direction. The silence in the hall at Keth Morin changed the way the air changes before a storm at high altitude, a pressure shift, a redistribution of the weight of everything in the room, a quality of attention that had been distributed evenly suddenly converging on a single point. The soldiers in their 2 columns did not move. The warden did not move. But something in the arrangement of the space had shifted, and I felt it across the back of my neck and along both forearms, and I stayed very still and kept the cord up. The warden looked at the cord for a long time. I counted seconds without moving my lips, the way you learn to count when you are in a position where you need to track time precisely, and any visible movement of the mouth is a mistake. He looked at it for 41 seconds, which is a very long time to hold a position in front of an audience that is also holding its position. And I know the count is accurate because I checked it twice internally, and then he stood up. He was taller standing than I had expected, even knowing the measurements from the intelligence files. The files give you numbers and the numbers had been correct, but numbers do not give you the quality of a thing, and the quality of the warden standing in his formal combat dress in a hall of pale sandstone columns of noon light was something that did not reduce to numbers. He came down the platform steps, 3 steps, unhurried, not quickly and not slowly, but with the specific pace of someone who has learned to move in ways that communicate deliberateness. And he crossed the distance between us, and he stopped 2 arm lengths away, and he looked at the cord again, closer now, and then he looked at my face. I want to be careful about what I say here, because I have been asked about this moment many times in the years since, and I have gotten it wrong almost as often as I have gotten it right, and the wrongness was never in the direction of embellishment, but in the direction of reduction, of saying less than was there because I did not have the right words for it. Describing the warden's face in that moment is something I can attempt with full honesty and still not guarantee accuracy. The Varath face in a moment of genuine recognition, sharp recognition, the kind that arrives without warning, does something that I have since seen described in 3 different xenocultural texts, all 3 of which acknowledge the limitations of the description. The orbital ridges lift fractionally, not much, a millimeter or 2, but enough to read if you have been shown the baseline. The auditory organs, which had been held flat against the skull, angle outward by a few degrees, which is the Varath equivalent of a human's ears coming forward, the body's involuntary response to something that needs to be heard. The musculature around the jaw shifts in a way that might read, to a human observer, as the beginning of speech, or might read as the physical effect of something arriving suddenly in the body, and the body needing a moment to stabilize around it. I am going to say he recognized it. I am going to say that the cord in my fist meant something specific to him, something he had not expected to see in this room in this conversation on this day, and that the recognition of it moved through his body the way a physical impact moves through a standing structure. A single moment of arrival, and then the adjustments, the resettling, the body finding its new equilibrium. He said something. A single word in Varath that I did not know, said at a volume that was not loud but was not quiet, a carrying volume, a pitch to the room volume, and every one of the 300 soldiers in the hall heard it, and I could tell from the quality of the silence that followed that it meant something to them too. Not surprise, or not only surprise. Recognition had a particular texture in a room full of people who shared a common code, and what moved through the hall in the wake of that single word had texture. He reached out, and he took the cord from my hand. He did not take it quickly. He took it with the deliberate care of someone handling a thing that has been established to require care, thumb and forefinger closing around the braided middle section, taking the weight of it as if gauging something, and then the whole hand closing around it until it disappeared inside his fist. He stood there with his fist closed around the cord, and he looked at me again. I had not moved. I had been standing in the same position for, I checked, internally, somewhere around 4 minutes total from the moment I had stopped at the base of the platform steps. My right arm was back at my side. The waxed cloth was in my left hand. I was looking at the warden's face and attempting to read it with the tools the linguist had given me, and achieving limited results, and in the quiet background part of my mind that runs the ongoing calculations of whether I am about to die or not, I was noting that the soldiers had not drawn and updating that assessment continuously as the seconds passed. He spoke again. More Varath, this time longer, a full sentence, possibly two, directed not at me but at the hall, at the soldiers in their 2 columns. The same carrying volume, built to reach the full room without effort. I caught 2 words I recognized from the linguist's preliminary briefing, one that was part of the formal vocabulary around witnessing, a word that appeared in oath law contexts to indicate that something was being legally registered, and one that was from the formal vocabulary around cord law itself, a word that appeared specifically in the binding formulas. She had flagged those words in the briefing materials with a note. If you hear either of these, do not move and do not speak. I did not move and did not speak. The soldiers sheathed nothing, they did not move. But the weight of the room had redistributed again, and this time I could read the direction of the change more clearly even if I still could not name its precise content. They were not at ease, but they were not in a position of imminent decision either. They were in the position the warden had put them in with his words, which was the position of witnesses being required to witness. Whatever he had said to them had given the moment a formal character, and formal moments in Varath oath law required a particular kind of stillness. He turned back to me. He said, in standard, accented, the vowels shaped around the underlying structure of Varath, effortful in a way that had nothing to do with incompetence and everything to do with a person working carefully in a second language, because the words need to be right. And I remember thinking, as he formed the question, that the care he was taking with the language was itself information. A man who did not care about the answer asks the question quickly, in whatever form comes first. A man who cares about the answer takes the time to get the question right, even in a second language, even in front of 300 witnesses. How did you come to carry this? It was the question I had been preparing for in the abstract, since the moment I understood that the cord was important. Now that it was in front of me, it was not abstract at all. It was a man, a Varath warlord court warden with a cord in his closed fist, standing 2 arm lengths away, and asking me how I had come to be holding something that was clearly important to him, in ways that the xenocultural analysis teams and the linguists' preliminary notes and 11 months of my own consideration had not fully explained. I told him the truth. I told it simply, The way you tell a thing when you have been carrying it for 11 months and you are finally in the room where you can set it down. I told him about Kale Drossian, using the name Kale had given me because I did not know his Varath name and was not sure the Varath name would be the correct one to use in this context. I told him about the Thresh corridor and the medevac transport and the circumstances, without clinical detail, because clinical detail was not what the moment required. I told him about the 3 hours. I told him what Kale had said, one sentence, word for word, because I had been carrying that sentence alongside the cord for 11 months, and I knew it with the same completeness I knew my own name. When you meet the Warden, show him this. He will know what it means. The Warden was quiet for a moment after I finished. He was looking at his closed fist, not at me, and I did not push the silence. The linguist had told me, in one of our preparation sessions, that the Varath read silence differently than humans typically do in high-stakes conversations. That where a human might feel a silence after an emotional disclosure as inadequate response or discomfort, a Varath reads deliberate silence as acknowledgement, as weight given to the thing said. I gave it weight. After 30 or 40 seconds, he looked up at me again. "He was my brother," he said. He said it the same way he had said the single Varath word in the hall, not loudly, not as a performance, simply as information being placed in the room where it needed to be. His face did not change in the ways I would have tracked in a human face. The auditory organs stayed angled out from the skull. The orbital ridges stayed at the lifted position. He continued looking at me steadily, and I held the look, and I did not say anything, and neither did he for a long time. The hall was very quiet. The light was still coming down in its angled columns, and the 300 soldiers were still standing in theirs, and the noon sun was moving, degree by degree, the way it does when you are not looking at it, and then you look up and discover that the angle of a light column has shifted 2 or 3 centimeters across the stone floor since the last time you checked. "Kale broke his cord 3 years ago," the Warden said eventually. "Under our law, a cord breaker cannot be mourned by the house they left. We cannot hold the rights. We cannot say the words. The cord itself," he glanced at his fist again briefly, "the cord itself is meant to be destroyed. A cord breaker has no cord. That is part of what breaking means. You break the cord. You destroy it. What you were is gone." I waited. "He kept it," the Warden said. "He kept the cord and carried it for 3 years. He gave it to a human who had never heard of our oath law, and he told that human to bring it here." He paused. "That is not what a cord breaker does. By our law, by any reading of our law, that is not what a cord breaker does. A cord breaker has made a judgment. He had made his judgment. The judgment was that the line was unworthy, but he kept the cord." I had been thinking about what the cord meant for 11 months. I had 3 xenocultural analysis team reports that collectively amounted to uncertainty. Now I was standing in a hall at Keth Morin listening to the Warden explain it to me in standard, slowly and with precision, and I want to be honest. I did not understand it fully in that moment. I understood enough of it. I understood that the keeping was a statement, that Kale's decision not to destroy the cord was a communication, directed specifically at the Warden, communicated through the only channel Kale had available at the end, which was a human scout whose quality of patience he had apparently assessed as sufficient. "He kept it because it was not the cord he had broken," the Warden said. "He had broken from the line. He had not broken from the brother. In our law, those are 2 different things. In practice, something moved in his face that I could not name and did not try to. In practice, we treat them as the same thing, because we have to, because the law does not have a provision for the difference. He kept the cord because he had found the difference, and he had no way to say it, except this." I said, "He asked me to bring it here." "Yes," the Warden said. "He believed you would understand what it meant." "Yes," he looked at the fist again. "He was right." The silence after that had a different quality than the silences before. Less weight, not more, lighter, as if something had been put down rather than suspended. I was aware that behind me, somewhere in the formation of 300 soldiers, the quality of the room's attention had also shifted, had moved from the watchful rigidity of formal witnessing into something slightly less rigid, slightly more settled. He reached into the collar of his garment, the formal combat dress, the collar cut higher than a human garment, secured with a single horizontal fastening at the throat, and he drew out a length of his own cord. Not the same cord. His was a different braiding pattern, the ends finished with a different knot, though the leather was the same dark color and had the same worn quality in the middle that came from being held in a fist for years. He held it alongside Cale's cord in his open palm, the two of them lying side by side, and he looked at them together for a long moment. Longer than the 41 seconds he had looked at the cord in my fist, and that pause had already been long enough to change the room, and then he looked at me. "You carried my brother's cord faithfully," he said. 11 months, without knowing its meaning, without obligation, without being asked in any formal sense. You were asked by a dying man in a transport going down, and that is not a context in which a request creates legal obligation. He paused. In our law, an act performed faithfully in the absence of obligation has a name. The name is different from the name for an act performed faithfully because of obligation. The distinction matters to us in ways that may not translate. I thought about that. I thought about the difference between carrying a thing because you had to and carrying it because a dying man had asked you to, and you had decided his asking was sufficient reason. I was not sure the distinction translated, and I was also not sure it didn't. "He trusted you with it," the warden said. "That is itself a statement. A cord breaker in our law has removed themselves from the network of trust that the cord represents. They are outside it. They cannot make obligations within it, cannot receive protections from it, cannot call on it. And yet he gave you the cord to carry. That act is—" He stopped. He was searching for the word in standard and not finding quite the right one. He tried again. "That act is not nothing. Under our law, giving a cord to be carried is a form of speech. It says something. What it says depends on who gives it and to whom and under what conditions. What it says in this case," he looked at the two cords in his palm again, "is that he found someone worth trusting outside the structure after he had left the structure. That is also a statement." He closed his hand around both cords. "My brother was—" He paused again, not searching for a word this time. The pause was a different kind. He was correct about the things he was correct about. He was not wrong in his judgment of the line. He was not wrong to leave it. I have had 3 years to look at what he saw, and I have not found his reasoning faulty. He looked at me directly. I want to say that clearly in front of witnesses, because it is true and it has not been said, and the cord he kept suggests he may have hoped it would eventually be said. By me, in a room where it counted. There was nothing I could say to that. The room had shifted again, not the subtle weight redistribution of the earlier silences, but something more open, a quality of air that arrived when a thing that has been held under pressure for a long time is released. Whether the 300 soldiers in their columns felt it in the same way I did, I cannot say. Whether the Varath feeling of release is the same as the human one, physiologically or psychologically, I cannot say. What I can say is that the hall felt in that moment like a hall rather than a weapon. Like a room that had been built to contain something and was now being used for it and was adequate to the task. He did not offer me the second cord. I understood from the way his hand was positioned, not extended toward me but turned slightly inward, the cords visible but contained within his own grasp, that what he was showing me was the fact of the two cords in relationship. Not an offer but a declaration. He was placing two things in a specific position relative to each other, and that placement was, in itself, a statement under the law he had been describing. It took me a moment to understand what the correct response was. When I understood it, I was aware that the understanding was the result of 11 months of study, and also of something simpler. Standing in a room with a grieving man who was showing me the two cords in his open hand, and having enough stillness to wait until I understood what he needed me to do. I reached into my breast pocket. I took out the waxed cloth, which I had been holding in my left hand since I took the cord from it. I folded it open, smooth side up, and I placed it on the stone floor between us, flat and still in the hard noon light. He looked at the cloth, he looked at me. Then he placed both cords on the cloth, his and Cale's, side by side, the different braid patterns visible, the two worn middles both darkened and polished from years of being held in different hands, and he stepped back. It was, as far as I understood it, an acknowledgement. Not a treaty, not a concession, not an agreement about the shape of a table or the terms of a ceasefire. Those things would take months more and many more people than the two of us, and they would require the kind of careful documented negotiation that I had been trained for in none of my career. What it was, I think, what I have believed it was in the years since, and what the linguist confirmed when I finally reached her and described what had happened, was a formal recognition. The warden's acknowledgement, in front of 300 witnesses who understood what two cords placed on a cloth between a Varath and a non-Varath meant under oath law, that the matter of Cale Drossian's cord was no longer outside the structure, that the cord had been carried faithfully and delivered faithfully and could be counted, that the act of carrying it had brought it inside the law, even though the law had no provision for it. The law had been given a provision, right there in the hall, in front of the witnesses. That was what he had called them to witness. I folded the cloth over the two cords. I did not put it back in my pocket. I left it on the floor between us, folded and still. He looked at the folded cloth for a long moment. His auditory organs were still angled outward. He did not speak. Then he turned and walked back to the platform and climbed the 3 steps and sat down in the dark wood chair, and he put his hands on the arms of the chair, and he looked straight ahead. The hall was silent. The noon light came down in its angled columns. The 300 soldiers stood in theirs. I turned and walked back the way I had come, through the alternating bands of light and shadow, the full length of the hall. The soldiers on either side stood as they had stood when I entered, with both blades across their backs, with the absolute economy of their training. None of them stepped out of the column. None of them reached for a blade. I walked to the gate and through it and back out into the hard, white noon light of the plateau road, and I kept walking until I reached the first switchback, and then I sat down on a flat piece of roadside stone because my body had decided it was done standing. I sat there for a while. The sun moved. The sandstone face of Keth Morin caught the light at the particular angle of early afternoon, when the shadows that had been absent at noon began to reappear along the carved edges of the rampart slits. Thin and precise, the geometry of deliberate cutting rendered suddenly visible by the shift in the light's direction. I thought about something the warden had said, standing in the hall, that I had not had space to fully process at the time. He had said that Cale's judgment of the line had not been wrong. He had said it in front of 300 witnesses, in a formal register that the linguist had later confirmed was the register of a public statement under oath law, a statement that once made could not be unmade. He had, in effect, endorsed the cord breaking. Not the act of leaving, the Varath law on that was clear, and he had not suggested it would be changed, but the judgment that had motivated it. He had told the room that his brother had been right. I did not know what that cost him. I suspected it was not nothing. A warden who publicly endorses a cordbreaker's judgment is making a statement about his own house, his own inheritance, his own understanding of where the house had gone wrong. That is not a small thing to say in a room full of people whose loyalty to the house is their entire structure. I suspected that the 300 soldiers in the hall had not all heard it the same way, and that whatever happened in Keth Morin in the days and weeks after I walked down the switchback road would be more complicated, internally, than anyone's after-action report would capture. But he had said it. He had chosen to say it in that room on that day with those witnesses. He had decided that the thing Cale had wanted said was worth saying, regardless of what it cost to say it. I thought about Cale, not about the politics of what had just happened, not about the report I would have to write or the conversations I would have to have with the people who would want the full account of every word and every gesture. I thought about Cale specifically, the weight of him in the back of a transport, the particular way his voice had sounded when he was working in standard, careful, exact, choosing each word with the attention of someone who believes words are finite and does not intend to waste them. The way he had held the cord in the months I had known him, without my ever noticing he was holding it. I had not been looking for it. It had been there in his hand or in his pocket, and I had been looking at other things, and then it was in my hand. 7 months we had worked together in the border zone. 7 months of him in a unit where he was, by any formal measure, an anomaly, a Varath cord breaker fighting alongside humans, carrying no weapons, performing the work of liaison and translation, and the particular kind of cultural mediation that only someone who has lived on both sides of a thing can perform. He had been in those 7 months, consistently and precisely useful. He had also been, when there was time for it, something that the word useful did not cover, present in the way that people are present when they have thought carefully about where they want to put their attention, and they have decided to put it here. He had decided I was sufficient to carry the cord. I had no idea when he made that decision what it required of me. I only understood it in retrospect, that carrying the cord faithfully meant carrying it for as long as it took, without knowing whether it would ever matter, into whatever room could receive it. That was the whole requirement. That was what he had assessed in 7 months of working alongside me that I had the quality for. I had spent 11 months wondering if I was doing it right. The wondering had been, in its own way, beside the point. You either carry a thing faithfully or you don't, and whether you are doing it right is not really a question that opens itself to useful analysis while you are in the middle of doing it. You just carry it. You keep it in your breast pocket and you keep trying to get to the right room, and when you are in the right room you take it out. The linguist had told me in our last preparation session that Varath oath law contained a concept she had no good standard equivalent for, a word that described the quality of an act performed correctly in a context for which no provision had been written. She had offered several approximations: faithfulness, exactness, the precision of a right response to a new situation. None of them quite reached it. The closest she could get was this: doing the correct thing in a situation where nobody told you what the correct thing was, because you were paying enough attention to know it anyway. I thought about that, sitting on the roadside stone with the early afternoon sun shifting the shadow angles across the plateau face of Keth Morin. I thought about Cale keeping the cord for 3 years after the breaking, carrying it without expectation of an outcome, because the keeping was itself the statement, and the statement needed to be made regardless of outcome. I thought about the warden in his hall, standing in front of 300 witnesses, placing his own cord alongside his brother's on a square of waxed cloth held by a human who had arrived without credentials and without authority, and with nothing to offer except the cord and 11 months of faithfulness to a dead man's last request. I had known, in an abstract way, since the beginning of the 11 months, that what I was carrying was not mine. That seems obvious when stated plainly, but the experience of carrying a thing that is not yours, across a long time and through circumstances that give you many opportunities to set it down, is less obvious in practice than it is in principle. There were months when the back-channel couriers returned with nothing, or with a rejection, and I had sat with the cord in my breast pocket and considered, as honestly as I could, whether the mission was real or whether I had constructed a mission around an object, because the object gave me something to do while the war continued. I had considered whether Cale's dying instruction had been exactly what it sounded like, or whether it had been the disoriented request of a man losing blood in the back of a failing transport, a last grip on something that felt important, without the clear-eyed judgment of a man in full possession of his faculties. I had considered this seriously, not as a way of dismissing the cord, but because carrying it faithfully meant being honest about what it was and what it wasn't, and I could not be honest about it without considering whether it was real. Every time I considered it, I came back to the quality of Cale's voice. He had been losing blood for hours by the time the transport went down, and he had been in pain, and he had been working in a second language, and none of that had changed the way he chose his words. He had chosen them with the same precision he always used, slowly, without waste, and he had looked at me while he said them with the attention of a man who was making sure the thing he was saying would land correctly. He had not been delirious. He had been specific. You cannot fake specificity on that level, not at the end of things, not when the effort of speaking is already high. I carried it because he had been specific. That was the whole reason. It was not complicated, and it did not need to be. There is a version of this story in which what I did was remarkable. I have heard that version told. I have heard it told in ways that made it sound like a mission, a strategy, a calculated act of diplomatic genius. That version is wrong in the way that most stories about patience are wrong. It mistakes the outcome for the intention. I was not trying to move the warden. I was trying to deliver the cord. The cord was Cale's. The message was Cale's. The relationship that mattered, the one that had held, improbably and illegally and against all provisions of the law that governed it, across 3 years of accord breaking and 7 months of a border war and 3 hours of a dying man's time, was Cale's. I just carried it. That is a smaller thing than a diplomatic mission. It is also, I have come to think, a more reliable one. You cannot carry something faithfully if what you are carrying is a strategy. You can only carry a thing faithfully if what you are carrying is the thing itself. Somewhere behind the pale sandstone walls of Kethmoran, in a hall I was no longer inside, a warden was sitting in a dark wood chair with his hands on the arms, looking straight ahead, in front of 300 witnesses who had seen 2 cords placed on a cloth and folded together. Whether those witnesses understood everything that had happened in that room I could not say. Whether the warden knew what the next step was I could not say. Whether any of it would lead to the other conversations, the documented negotiations, the shape of the table, I could not say. What I could say was that the cord was there. It was in the hall, folded in the cloth, with both cords together. It was no longer in my pocket where it had been for 11 months. I had done what Cale asked. That was the whole of the mission, reduced to its smallest accurate form. A dying man had pressed a cord into a scout's hand and said a sentence, and the scout had carried the cord faithfully for as long as it took, and delivered it to the correct room and shown it to the correct person, and the correct person had recognized it. Everything after that belonged to time and to the Varath, and to the long, slow work of people who were not me. I stood up from the roadside stone and checked my gear and oriented myself on the long descent, and began walking back down the plateau toward the forward position where the courier was waiting. The road was still pale and straight in the afternoon light. The shadows were longer now, angled east, and the sandstone had gone from the bleached white of noon to a warmer tone, the color of things that have been in the sun all day and have absorbed it and are giving it back. I did not look back at the citadel. There was nothing up there I needed to see again. I had carried the cord. I had shown him. He knew what it meant.